June 6, 1944 to 5 a.m., Crisac Battery, Normandy coast. The binoculars quivered slightly as Lieutenant Zuri Walter Olmsen scanned the horizon, etching into his memory a vision that would haunt him for life. In the dim, pre-dawn light, he saw something that contradicted every assurance from the High Command. The English Channel, that natural barrier which had long protected the Third Reich's western flank, had become a steel artery, an unbroken armada of vessels stretching as far as the eye could see, their dark silhouettes merging into a continuous wave of impending doom. The invasion force consisted of 6,139 ships, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary vessels, and 864 merchant ships, crewed by more than 195,000 sailors and Marines from 8 Allied nations. At 5:52 a.m., Olmsen's battery received the order to open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells from his 210 mm checkmate Skoda cannons arced toward the approaching fleet, a mere drop of water against an oncoming tsunami. His guns engaged the U.S. cruisers Tuscaloosa and Quincy, along with the battleship Nevada. By 6:30 a.m., his battery would claim the destroyer Corey, the only U.S. destroyer lost on D-Day. From his reinforced concrete observation post atop the Crisac Battery, the 32-year-old officer became the first German defender to sight and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. What Olmsen saw through his Zeiss rangefinder was more than a fleet. It was the tangible proof of an industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had insisted could not exist. The numbers of defeat were advancing toward him at 8 knots. Within hours, German officers across Normandy would witness the full scale of Allied industrial power, shattering assumptions about their enemy's capabilities and signaling the beginning of the end for Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The night of June 5th had already brought warning signs. At Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, 50 miles inland, Lieutenant General Hans Spidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rommel since April 15th, monitored increasingly alarming reports. Rommel himself was absent in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too poor for any invasion attempt. At 1:20 a.m., the 7th Army received notification of massive parachute drops across Normandy. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, totaling over 13,000 men, were being deployed by Douglas C-47 Skytrains. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from St. Lo, immediately grasped the implications. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx possessed tactical instincts honed to a razor's edge by years of combat. Yet even he could not imagine the magnitude of what approached. The German defenses had been prepared for an invasion, but not for an industrial avalanche that would bury them beneath sheer material superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger, Rommel's naval advisor since November 1943 and a lifelong seaman, had spent months inspecting the coastline. He had pressed for additional mines, obstacles, and artillery, but as he later wrote in his memoir, Rommel in Normandy, "We were preparing to fight the last war. They were bringing the next one." The High Command had convinced itself that the Allies could mount an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions, supported by maybe 3,000 vessels, based on Germany's own limitations and experience of scarcity. But as dawn broke over Normandy on June 6th, observers along the coast from Cherbourg to Le Havre reported the impossible. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. Not a raid, but the largest amphibious invasion in human history. At Strongpoint WN-62, overlooking what would become Omaha Beach, 20-year-old farm boy Heinrich So peered through his machine gun embrasure at 5:45 a.m. He had never seen the ocean before arriving in Normandy. Now he saw no water at all, only an endless tide of steel. Ships everywhere, So would later write. Big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count but stopped at 100. There were thousands. Across the 50-mile invasion front, German officers and soldiers came to the same shocking realization. They were facing not just superior numbers, but an entirely new scale of force. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors pounded the Atlantic wall. The German defenders were learning the first lesson of American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone fired 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the first hour, each shell weighing 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, one ship had delivered 178 tons of explosives, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in total reserves. Before the first soldiers set foot on the sand, the Allied fleet had fired roughly 130,000 tons of shells, 50,000 from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships. General des Infantry Guy Blumenriet, Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West, later remarked, "We had prepared to fight men. We found ourselves fighting factories." By 6:00 a.m., as naval shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall, German defenders witnessed the second demonstration of Allied industrial dominance. The sky filled with aircraft, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landings, having already secured air supremacy. The Luftwaffe fielded only around 300 operational planes in France, managing 319 sorties that day. For every German plane, there were 46 Allied aircraft. Major Joseph Prill, commanding JG-26, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches that morning. With only his wingman, Hinz Vodacek, he strafed Sword Beach once before retreating from dozens of Allied fighters, a stark illustration of German air impotence. Despite the overwhelming firepower, some German positions initially believed they might hold. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division manned fortified bluffs with machine guns in concrete bunkers, creating interlocking fields of fire. When the first waves of American infantry from the 1st and 29th Divisions hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., the slaughter began. Heinrich Sau, operating an MG-42 at Widerstand Nest 62, fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. He watched Americans fall by the dozens, even hundreds. Bodies drifted in the surf, the beach stained crimson. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might withstand the assault until the destroyers arrived. Around 8 a.m., as the situation on Omaha Beach teetered on the brink of disaster and General Omar Bradley considered ordering a withdrawal, an extraordinary event unfolded. American destroyers, disregarding the dangers of grounding or mines, advanced to within 1,000 yards of the shoreline, a range at which naval guns were virtually unstoppable. The USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt trained their 5-inch batteries on individual German fortifications. At such close quarters, missing was impossible. This maneuver, well recorded in naval logs, proved pivotal in shattering the German defenses at Omaha. German officers began to grasp the full scope of American industrial power. It was not just the quantity of ships, but the audacity to employ them, risking each one as if expendable. Although the destroyer USS Corey was lost, others immediately took its place. For the Americans, ships were not irreplaceable treasures but functional instruments, and they had thousands more ready. As the morning wore on, German observers witnessed something that defied all prior notions of amphibious warfare. Landing craft continued to arrive relentlessly, wave after wave, hour after hour, a ceaseless conveyor delivering men and materiel from sea to shore. The variety of specialized vessels left German eyes wide with disbelief. LCTs, landing craft, tank, rolled 30-ton Sherman tanks straight onto the beaches. LSTs, landing ship, tank, enormous 328-foot-long ships, grounded themselves and opened their bow doors to unload entire tank companies. DUKW amphibious trucks swam ashore, drove up the sand, and delivered supplies directly to frontline units. By nightfall, Allied forces had landed roughly 156,000 troops, 132,715 by sea, and 23,400 airborne. This contingent outnumbered the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In the first 24 hours alone, the Allies had deployed 156,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The German defenders possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks. The first day alone saw the Allies landing 3 times that number. The German response revealed not only material inferiority but systemic paralysis when confronted with overwhelming enemy power. The storied panzer divisions, which had overrun France in 6 weeks in 1940, were rendered immobile by Allied air dominance and naval bombardment. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit within striking distance, did not begin its counterattack until 4 p.m. 3 hours were required to cover 10 miles from Runville, turning what should have been a decisive armored thrust into a slow procession of burning vehicles. When surviving panzer units finally encountered British forces near Sword Beach, naval gunfire from forward observers struck them relentlessly. HMS Warspite, stationed 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch shells capable of piercing any tank. SS Standartenführer Kurt Mehr, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, later wrote, "The enemy's material superiority was so immense that our own strength was swept away like waves crashing on rocks." By June 7th, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that stunned senior officers. The Allies were constructing harbors, not simply capturing ports, entire artificial ports built in open water. The Mulberry Harbors, prefabricated in Britain, were an industrial feat of staggering scale. 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 scuttled ships forming breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, they handled 9,000 tons of supplies daily, exceeding the capacity of many French ports. 4 years of German labor on the Atlantic Wall had been rendered irrelevant. The Allies had bypassed the need for ports entirely. Throughout June 1944, German commanders gradually recognized the magnitude of their intelligence failure. The deception of Operation Fortitude had convinced them that the Normandy landings were a diversion, and that the main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, spearheaded by Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. German reserves remained frozen, awaiting an assault that never arrived. General Leo von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, discovered the ruse when captured documents revealed Patton's real location commanding the genuine Third Army in Normandy. As June turned into July, German officers' reports to headquarters became increasingly desperate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a call from Hitler at OKW, demanding an explanation for why the invasion had not been repelled. When asked for a recommendation, Rundstedt reportedly replied, "Make peace, you fools. What else can we do?" For his candor, he was swiftly relieved of command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler on June 17th at Margivau, France presenting irrefutable statistics. Allied air supremacy, depleted German divisions at 30% strength, and the impossibility of daylight movement under naval gunfire. Hitler's response was to forbid retreat, insisting on fanatical resistance. Rommel left the meeting with grim clarity. Germany was doomed. Within a month, he would be implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, ultimately forced to commit suicide. Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, would later recount in Invasion 1944. Rommel and the Normandy campaign. "We were not defeated by better soldiers or superior strategy. We were overwhelmed under a deluge of material." The struggle for KH illustrated the futility of German resistance against the sheer weight of Allied resources. On July 7th, 467, RAF heavy bombers unleashed 2,500 tons of ordnance on Caen in just 40 minutes, more destructive force than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, one of Germany's elite units, entered Normandy with 20,540 men and 150 tanks. After 6 weeks, it had been reduced to 300 men and no tanks, suffering 8,000 casualties within the Falaise pocket alone. Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy beginning July 25th delivered the final testament to Allied dominance. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers carpeted a 6,000 x 2,200-yard area with 300 tons of bombs. General Lieutenant Fritz Bioline, commanding the Panzer Division directly under the bombardment, reported, "My division has been annihilated. We are not facing an army. We are facing an industrial machine." The Panzer Formation, which had arrived in Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, simply ceased to exist. Of 3,000 soldiers in the targeted zone, 1,000 perished instantly, 1,000 were wounded, and 1,000 were rendered psychologically incapable of fighting. Tragic friendly fire incidents claimed 111 American lives and wounded 490, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking U.S. officer killed in action in the European theater. Yet even these losses did not impede the operation's success. The Falaise Pocket, from August 12 to 21, 1944, became the graveyard of German forces in Normandy. The documented losses were staggering: 10,000, 15,000 Germans killed, 40,000 captured, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed in the northern sector alone, 2,447 vehicles abandoned, and 252 artillery pieces lost. Between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans escaped the encirclement, but only as scattered remnants rather than organized units. The German General Staff struggled to comprehend that they were not facing a traditional military campaign, but an industrial equation. The 1944 production comparison starkly highlighted Allied supremacy. German production, 1944. Aircraft, 39,870 peak. Tank production, 1,854 military. Trucks in December, 68,000 American. Production, 1944. Aircraft, 96,000. Tanks, 29,000. Military. Trucks, 650,000. These figures excluded British, Canadian, or Soviet output. Germany was pitted against the combined industrial capacity of the Allies with the production capabilities of a medium-sized nation, further diminished by relentless bombing. Total American wartime output included 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, calculated after the war that by 1944, Allied production superiority was roughly 5-1, reaching 10-1 in certain categories like trucks. Germany was not merely defeated, they were mathematically erased. German officers who survived Normandy were psychologically altered. They had witnessed not only military defeat, but the utter collapse of Nazi ideology asserting German superiority and American weakness. Young officers raised under Nazism were especially affected. They had been taught that Americans were soft, pampered, and incapable of real combat. Instead, they encountered Americans with machines to handle laborious tasks, radios for coordination, ample ammunition for practice, and confidence derived from limitless logistical support. Suicide rates among German officers spiked sharply. Defeat was one matter. The complete invalidation of their worldview was another. Beyond numbers, they faced a technology gap that revealed Germany's backwardness. Proximity fuses transformed anti-aircraft fire into precise killing. Radar-directed naval guns could strike targets miles inland with first-round accuracy, and DUKW amphibious trucks solved logistical challenges the Germans could scarcely imagine. Specialized Allied vehicles impressed German officers deeply. Hobart's Funnies, modified tanks that cleared mines, laid bridges, and demolished bunkers, demonstrated engineering solutions to battlefield problems rather than relying on blood alone. Naval gunfire became a source of dread. The battleship HMS Rodney's 16-inch guns could fire 2,448-pound shells 23 miles inland. USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite converted their main batteries into super-heavy artillery capable of obliterating any target. German artillery attempting counterfire learned quickly that ships moved, and fired back. By July 1944, daylight movement for German forces was virtually impossible. Allied fighter bombers, operating under cab rank control by forward observers, could strike any target within minutes. The statistics were overwhelming. Over 12,000 Allied aircraft in theater, 300 and 500 German planes, 5,000, 8,000 Allied sorties daily, 50, 100. German sorties when feasible. Final Normandy campaign numbers revealed the scale of industrial warfare. June 6, August 30th, 1944, personnel landed. 252,299 vehicles landed. 438,471 supplies delivered. 398,259. Tons aircraft sorties. 480,000 plus German losses included 240,000 killed, 200,000 captured, 2,200 tanks and assault guns lost, and over 40 divisions destroyed. In 1954, a decade after D-Day, surviving German officers convened in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge, delivered the keynote address. We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally. It was no longer a contest of armies but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production. The image that haunts me still is seeing American bulldozers push aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks. The German officers who witnessed D-Day were permanently altered. Hans Biedel became a NATO general, helping integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many Normandy veterans advocated European economic integration, recognizing that only pooled resources could match American industrial might. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy, reflected, "In Italy, we could fight the Allies on relatively equal terms. In Normandy, on open ground where they could deploy their full industrial might, our forces were simply erased." On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Olmsen returned to Chris Battery as an honored guest. The former Oberleutnant, now 73, stood at the same observation post where he first sighted the invasion fleet. Speaking to gathered veterans, both Allied and German, he reflected, 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible, a sea covered with ships from horizon to horizon. I realized in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. I fired my guns at that armada, and it was like throwing stones at the tide. We sank one destroyer, damaged a few others, but for every ship we hit, 100 passed unharmed. Young officers today study the tactics of Normandy, but the fundamental lesson is simpler. In contemporary warfare, the side with the greatest production capacity prevails. We realized that industrial output equates to military power. The vast armada I observed that morning was more than a fleet. It was the visible embodiment of American manufacturing strength. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied vessels advance on D-Day saw more than an invasion. They witnessed the future of combat, where industrial capability outweighed every traditional consideration. The vision that haunted them, the seemingly endless fleet stretching from horizon to horizon, was democracy's latent power unleashed, industrial force harnessed for military ends on a scale that rendered conventional martial skills irrelevant. They had trained for battle. Instead, they faced the full operational potential of the United States industry. In that instant of grim clarity, German officers understood that they were witnessing the end of warfare as they knew it and the emergence of something entirely new, industrialized conflict on a scale that made their expertise obsolete. Their defeat was not strategic but mathematical, not a failure of valor but a deficiency of logistics. It was a lesson etched in steel across the waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships declared that American industrial power had arrived in Europe, and the world of war would never be the same.